Hi Spring fans, welcome to another installment of Spring Tips. In this week's installment, we're going to take a look at something that's just been released, a brand new thing that we just announced in the last few days on the good old-fashioned Spring.io blog, the trustworthy, venerable Spring.io blog. That is, namely, the new support in Spring Batch for Kafka. Right, Mahmoud Ben Hassin, one of the legendary Spring Batch team members, just announced this, and I guess a large chunk of the contribution came from the community by Matthew Kelly. I'm going to go ahead and guess, or no, Wile. I'm not even sure. It's French, and I should know how to pronounce it, but I don't know. Either way, merci, thank you. So the point is, we have this nice new support in Spring Batch for working with Kafka. And I just came back from Brazil. I was in Brazil, let's say, 4 or 5 days ago. It's now Wednesday, right, as this goes up. And I was in Brazil just less than a week ago, okay? Let's say it's a week ago. And when I was in Brazil, I talked to a large Brazilian bank, and they're using Spring Batch. They're starting new projects in Spring Batch. Now, I love streaming processing, I love messaging, I love integration, I love all these things that have to do with sort of streaming workloads and moving data through processing pipelines. But at the end of the day, there are some things that just lend themselves naturally to batch. And I think a question that a lot of people struggle with is, how do I bridge these two universes? I've got things that are naturally finite, they are time boxed, they are windowed, they are whatever we need whatever, whatever you need to understand to understand that they are limited, right? There might be something that gets processed, and there's a report that gets sent out for management. There's some sort of analytics that are done, whatever, right? And so this is a very common thing: is how do I take my streaming processing pipelines, these things that are producing data all the time based on the online sort of transactional world that we live in, and how do I turn that into data? Well, one way to do that, of course, is to forward it onto Spring Batch. Now, Spring Batch is great because it can process large amounts of data, and Spring Batch has a lot of stuff built in that just makes life easier. A lot of stuff that I think most people don't really appreciate, and so they kind of take for granted what Spring Batch can do. But for example, Spring Batch runs in the background, and it has a database, a metadata system, and that metadata system is stored somewhere, namely in a job repository, which in turn, by default, stores it in a SQL data store. The benefit of this is that a Spring Batch job, which in terms of its domain model anyway, is a job composed of multiple steps, each of which describes how to read and then write and optionally process data, right? A job has metadata about the state of that job, of the execution of that job, persisted in the database. So if something should go wrong, as is wont to happen when you work in the real world, right? There's going to be data that sometimes got a failure of encoding or something like that, right? I saw, I think Holden Corral just tweeted or retweeted or something. She observed a tweet or OH to tweet or I don't know, something. She just tweeted something that I thought was really funny, which is if all of our JSON if we required a schema for all of our JSON, and again I'm paraphrasing here, but if we required a JSON file, a schema file for all of our JSON, then we wouldn't have any data. Basically, I don't know. I have no idea what that was. I may have very well took it out of context. It made me laugh though, because it's true, right? There's just this huge sort of world of data out there, and we need to make do with what we can, right? And that's how the large majority of, I think, work is done these days, is just normalizing that kind of stuff, right? So what are we going to do? We want to take data from the real world. We want to take it from the real world and process it. The easiest way I can think of doing that is with Spring Batch. Spring Batch has this metadata system. If something goes wrong, as it will, if you have invalid or invalidly formatted data, you can, as an operator, intervene in the job and restart it. You can also provide heuristics. You can say, okay, well, if I fail, some percent of the data or some number of records of the data, then go ahead and fail the whole job. But if it's just a small, if it's a subset of the data, then don't bother, right? Don't bother failing it. Just keep going. Just ignore those records. It works in chunks. So you have this idea of steps, and steps process. They read data in chunks, maybe X number of records, where X is whatever size boundary you can afford to both store in memory at the same time and lose possibly, right? Because if you lose one record in the chunk, then the whole chunk could possibly be lost. So chunks are, and it's also a unit of performance. How many records do I want to write to the downstream thing in a transaction, a logical transaction, if not an actual transaction, right? That's called a chunk. So I don't want to review all of Spring Batch again. We've done actually one of the earlier Spring Tips videos I did. One of the more popular ones, indeed, was a Spring Tip that just looked at Spring Batch 101, right? Spring Batch Basics 101. What I think is interesting here is this possibility of bridging Batch with messaging through the use of this new Kafka support. So that's what we're going to do today, friends. We're going to take a look at this really, really cool stuff. We can get at it from the Spring Initializer, of course. We can build new projects as usual. And this is already available. This Kafka support is going to be available in Spring Boot 2.2 M3 when that comes out. And in the meantime, it's available in the snapshot stuff, right? So it's Spring Batch 4.2.0 M2. And I'm going to be using Spring Boot 2.20 snapshot, which in turn pulls in Spring Batch 4.2.0 M2. Okay, so I'm just going to call this BK, Batch Kafka. Okay, and we're going to bring in the Kafka dependencies and the Spring Batch dependencies and H2. Now again, we're not doing anything with JDBC here, but Spring Batch needs to persist its metadata somewhere. I'll give it an in-memory data store. You can point this to really any modern sort of SQL JDBC data store, and it'll do the right thing. But I just want the fast restart cycle. So let's go ahead and generate a project. Here we are. Open this up. Alrighty. So we need to configure a few things. I want to get that out of the way first because it's early enough, it's early enough in the project that I'll be able to remember it. But if I forget, I might experience odd errors later on. So we need several things, and these are just regular Spring Boot and Spring for Kafka support properties, right? There's nothing special here. So we want consumer properties. Okay, so we're going to work with data here, first of all, in our code. We're going to create an entity or an object or a DTO called, guess what, customer. Get rid of that. Alrighty. So customer, that's going to be our thing, and the customer is going to have a field here. We'll have an ID, and we'll have a field called string name. And you know what I think I forgot to bring in again? I forgot to bring in Lombok, so I'll go ahead and just add this manually. We'll use Java 11. I should have done that. I should have done both of those things back at the initializer. But thankfully, this is just trivial even in the build because all the dependencies are managed for us, so I don't really pay a lot of... there's not a huge cost and complexity here as long as I know the group ID and the artifact, the versions, and all the exclusions and all that stuff is already managed for me by Spring Boot. Okay, so what do we want to do? We're going to have a consumer, and you can see our entity is going to use all the things that Lombok gives us. So generate a constructor, some setters, and toString equals hashcode, blah blah blah. And now that we know that, we need to, because it's Kafka, we need to specify a key deserializer, right? And I want to use long deserializer because our ID is a long, right? So here's this, and again I could and should probably do a whole video on just Kafka in Spring, and I've done some of that. You've seen me talk about Spring Cloud Stream. You've seen me talk about Spring Cloud Stream Kafka streams in particular. Spring Cloud Stream works with RabbitMQ or Kafka or AWS, Amazon Kinesis or Google Cloud PubSub or whatever, but it just as easily works with Spring Cloud Stream and Kafka. But I've also done one on Spring Cloud Stream Kafka Streams, which is interesting. Okay, good. We've got that. Now I want the value deserializer, so we're going to say value deserializer. Make sure I don't misspell it twice. And I'm going to use the JSON deserializer. All right, that's from the Spring project here. Not this one. There you go. Okay, so I've got this. Copy reference. Okay. I'm going to give it a group ID, naturally. So I'm going to call this customers group. Good. And producer will be key serializer will be a long serializer, so I'll look up the long serializer as well. Same idea, right? I just want to have a thing that will handle the persistence of the key in Kafka. In Kafka, you've got this concept of a message, and messages have keys, and then a body, and the body's the value. And now the reason that you have this concept of a key is because of the fact that really you're not dealing with a message queue. What you're dealing with is an append-only log. It's a data store. And so this makes it possible for you to use Spring Cloud Stream Kafka Streams to do some very interesting things that treat Kafka like a database, right? And a side effect of that is that you have to think about, well, keys, basically, which is fine, not a big deal. We can handle this. Don't know if we can handle much more, but we can certainly handle this, right? All right, there's the serializer, and we want the client ID, right? Is that right? Please. Yes. Goody. Okay. And one thing that's going to be an issue is it's going to ask us to, we're going to decode data. We're going to write two programs, and they're going to send data from one node to another. They're going to transit through Kafka, and on the other, as data pops out on the other side, we have to deserialize it, and we're going to do so using Jackson, which by default doesn't just deserialize arbitrary object. You have to tell it to relax, basically. And the way you do that is with a trusted package. So Kafka consumer properties is spring.json.trusted.packages equals asterisk packages. All right, good. And finally, we're going to be sending messages to the Kafka topic. A topic is it's the way that they say queue in Kafka. All right, and we want to specify the default one for the Kafka template. Okay, so that's everything that's common to both producer and consumer. Let's now break the examples down. So we're going to create a producer application, which is going to be a Spring Batch application that just reads from, well, actually I'm going to synthesize some data. It's just going to be a thing that's just going to pump data into Kafka, and then something else will come along on the reader side and read the data off the queue and write it to something else. Now, I don't want to actually get into the business of configuring, file inbound, file item readers or flat file item readers and Mongo item writers and that kind of stuff. So I'm just gonna, for the things that don't have to do with Kafka, the things that are the invariants in our demo, I'm just gonna provide dummy implementations of the interfaces expected, and we're gonna look mainly at what happens with Kafka. So, producer application. This is going to be the thing that will just pump data into a Kafka broker. It's going to be a Spring Batch application, and the first thing you have to do, of course, besides installing Spring Batch, besides making Spring Batch and Spring Boot rather work. So let's do that. Let's get that out of the way. Okay. We got this. Now we've got that. Now so it's a Spring application dot run. Okay. All right. There's this. Now it's a Spring Batch application. We need to tell Spring Boot to go ahead and create a Spring Batch job repository and launcher and all that stuff. And in order for that to happen, we need to say @enable batch processing. And that's the hard part, right? That's most of what we have to do to get Spring Batch working. The only thing then is we need to provide a definition of a job, and a job needs to have some steps and all that kind of stuff. So we're gonna create a writer that's gonna read data from this arbitrary, just invariant dummy reader. Okay. So what do we want? We want a bean that has a job. Okay. And in order to create the bean, we're going to inject a few things that we need. The least of which is a job builder factory. Okay. And a step builder factory. So I tend to just bring these in for every Spring Batch app I build these days. They just help. And I'm going to inject these into the constructor inside my main application. This is my configuration class. I'm just going to inject them in the constructor, but rather than write the constructor by hand, I'll use required args constructor, and we'll just use that. Okay, so this dot job builder factory dot get jobs. I don't know, whatever, job. I'm going to give it a, nope, that's not good. Job, please. Job. QuickTime just really drags this computer down. Okay, and then further we're going to have a step. We'll come back to that definition in just a moment. So step, good. Come back to you, but start is the step. Okay, and we're going to have an incrementer, a new run ID incrementer, just to create a new unique ID for the job itself, so that if I need to point to a particular one and say restart that one, I have that's the parameter that'll make this job invocation unique. Okay, good. So we've got now just a basic job with one step, and as I said before, the steps have 3 things: readers, writers, and processors. So our step will be, it'll be a thing that uses the step builder factory to S1, and then that will in turn chunk, let's say 10 records at a time. And in order to do that, we're going to read and write data of type customer. Okay, I'm going to import that from our DTO, and we're going to read data. So we'll come back to this in a second, but suffice it to say, it's going to be a very invariant thing. So reader equals new item reader. Nothing fancy here. For entities of type customer. Okay. Read that in. Okay, so there's our little reader. We'll come back to that in a second. And the writer. And the item writer, what I want to do is I want to use Kafka, right? So this is where the rubber meets the road here. That'll be a separate bean. And we'll just say @bean Kafka item writer. Managing entities with type long, key type long, of type customer, Kafka item writer. Good. Okay. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. Okay. All right. So there's our basic thing. We're going to use a builder here. Don't have to do a lot of work to get that to work. Kafka item writer dot the builder, don't we? So Kafka item writer builder build Kafka template. We'll inject the Kafka template parameterized in the same way. And again, Spring Boot's going to automatically configure that object for us based on the auto configuration. So we really need to get that, and Oh, we've already got it. I think we already injected it into the code, didn't we? No, we should. Okay, I'll just inject it here rather than sully the parameter list there. Why not? I'll probably use this again. There we go. It's complaining that it can't find it by type, but that's IntelliJ's tooling, not the actual sort of state of the world. What else? I need to tell it how to take a object and turn it into a thing that it can send. In order to do that, it needs to have a key. So I'm going to tell it how to convert a customer into a key, and the customer is the object that we're taking, right? So a new customer. Okay. So the converter from customer to long. There you go. Kafka item writer. The key and then value. Okay. All right. Good. So customer dot get ID. All right. Seems easy enough, right? I think I can do this. That should work. We've got the topic specified. So the only thing we really need now is our reader. Is that true? I think that's fair. Kafka item writer. And finally our reader. Now the reader, all this thing is going to do is it's going to create a new unique ID using an atomic long. Okay. It's just dummy data. You can get your data from anything for which there's an item reader, of which that list is a long list. So you can see Neo4j and Hibernate and JDBC and JSON and LDIF and lists and Mongo and repositories and XML and files and stored procedures and all these kinds of things, and so that's fine, right? We don't need to worry about that. But I'm gonna just synthesize some dummy data here, and the ID will be increment and get. Actually, better yet, we're going to say if id.increment and get less than 10,000, then we want to get we're going to create a new customer, and we'll say if math random is greater than 0.5, we'll use Jane, otherwise Jose. Okay, there we go. And finally, we'll return null. So null means the end of the batch. So again, this is great for, like, if you imagine you have a job that writes things to a Kafka queue, or a topic rather, and something comes along in the evening or whatever every hour, and then just consumes everything from that queue, that topic, and then does some processing. It writes it to a CSV file, it writes it to a database, any standard ETL, or in this case, you're taking data from a streaming system and you're moving it into persistence, archival, right? You want to store it in a database or something like that. Spring Batch is perfect for that, because now you can tap whatever data is coming out of the streaming system. Once you're done with it, you send it to a place with a large buffer size, so that you can keep whatever, half an hour, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever worth of data. Then you run this job, right, every whatever, and it'll start pulling down data, and then writing it to your back end system. So here I'm just creating a reader that will just keep producing new records until I have 10,000 records. Okay, once it's done, it'll send null. It'll return null, and that tells Spring Batch to stop trying to read. And it's going to read, by the way. It's going to keep reading. It'll keep calling read until it reaches its chunk size, at which point it'll accumulate all those red items into a container, a collection, and ship it to the writer. And the writer is the Kafka item writer. So that chunk size that you saw me specify in the job step down here, 10, it's going to do that 1,000 times, basically. It's going to accumulate 10 at a time into memory, and then write all 10 to the Kafka item writer, which is going to try and do it in a logical transaction, as fast as possible, if not an actual transaction. So if you're using JDBC, that's an actual transaction. It'll actually put everything in one logical transaction, and if something fails in writing any one of those 10 records, it'll roll back all 10. Okay, so let's see. That looks normal. Good, don't need that. There's our code. That's a program that'll write data. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up Kafka cat here. Okay, so we want Kafka cat, and topic will be customers. And what else does it need? It needs the broker minus b localhost 9092. Okay, so there's the data that we had before. Is there? Oh, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just restart everything. I'll just reset my Kafka setup by I'm using Confluence desktop thing, and it installs everything nice and easy, so I don't have to worry about it. So let me see. Source. Okay. Good stuff. Okay. So I've just reset everything. I've got no, I just reinstalled everything, from nothing. And now you can see that this doesn't exist. There's no data there. There's nothing, right? So I now need to run this program, and that'll actually initialize my destination. So here's my producer. Let's run it. Okay, so the program ran. Didn't take very long at all, even with my CPU being pegged because of QuickTime recording. And so if I go here, you can see I've got, all the data that I thought I should have. Okay, so there's that. That's good. Now what? We have all the data in the Kafka queue, and now I want to read it, don't I? So I want to go now and create a consumer application. So here it is here. Consumer Kafka consumer, consumer application. And here we're going to do the same thing in reverse. We're going to read the data that's been written to the database, or in this case to Kafka. So Spring Boot application. And by the way, a very common thing is to use Spring Batch and Spring Integration together. So maybe you are using Spring Integration and you're doing messaging, and that's the thing that's producing the data, right? And so you get a channel that has data in it. There's something called a job launching message handler, and that comes from the Spring Batch integration project. And what that does is it does exactly that. You send a message to the job launching message handler telling it what job you want to launch and what parameters you want to use. And as a result of a message coming in on a channel, it'll kick off a Spring Batch job. By default, the way we're using it right now, when you run the Spring Boot program, it automatically launches any Spring Batch jobs that are in the application context. But if you want to run a job as a result of some sort of processing pipeline, maybe you see a file or something like that, you can say, here's a inbound file adapter in Spring Integration parlance that notices a new file in some sort of mount or something, and then that kicks off the job, which does the ETL, which then writes that data to Kafka, right? Or whatever. And then if it writes it to Kafka, that can trigger some sort of streaming processing pipeline, which then has an output, which then needs to be loaded back into the database. And that's where Spring Batch can help you again, as a listener, as a consumer. And that's what we're going to look at right here. So let's do that. We need the same kind of basic setup as the first time, right? We've got the @enable Spring Batch. Okay. Or batch processing, I suppose. Good. Public static void main. Alrighty. Okay. Dot run consumer application dot class. Cool. And what do we want to do? Well, we want to have a job. Okay. So in order to create the job, we need the job launcher factory and the job builder factory and the step builder factory. So same as before. Job builder factory. Okay, same thing as before. I want to inject that into the constructor. I'll say required args constructor. That'll create a constructor that has parameters and storage for these fields. It'll automatically initialize them, doing exactly what I would do if I hit Alt-Enter and just generate the constructor. And once I have the job, what do I want to do? I want to say job builder factory dot get job, whatever, incrementer, new run ID incrementer, start build. Right? We need a step, so I'll come back to this in a second. Goody. Okay. And our step is, again, we're going to read data. So nothing particularly fancy here. It's going to be using the step builder factory. You should give them more descriptive names, because remember, this gets persisted to the database. It's how we can look up the state of this particular step later on. So don't do as I'm doing. Do better. I know you can. So we're gonna read data here. So the chunk really is, what are we gonna write to? In this case, I'm gonna write to the console. I'm just gonna write I'm gonna plug in a dummy item writer that would just log all the data. Nothing interesting here, so it doesn't really matter what the chunk size is. There's no risk of there's no risk of like being overwhelmed. It's just no real risk really. I'm just gonna log stuff out. But you should definitely take more care when you set this than I have, because I don't really need to. I'm not writing to anything. And by the way, that's a good point. You can use Kafka as a way to stage, as a way to absorb writes. So Kafka can take it. If you're not sure, if you have a lot of data that needs to be written into a SQL data store like Oracle or something like that, don't drop. You can't drop the same amount of data on an Oracle database. You can't write to an Oracle database, even if you drop all the indexes and all that stuff. You're just not going to be able to write as fast as you can to a Kafka. So this might be exactly the kind of thing you need, which is you have something that can drain the queue and then attempt to write to the Oracle database slowly. And you can do things with Spring Batch. You can actually do remote chunking, where you actually have it spin off, where it actually fans out to worker nodes on a cluster, and then it pulls in data from the Kafka. I can imagine it pulling data down from a different topic or different partitions in Kafka on each node, for example. Lots of opportunities built into Spring Batch as a framework itself, and those only get better with Kafka, which is built for scale as well. So, okay, step builder factory writer is, we're going to plug that in. I said var writer, new item writer, customer. Okay. All right. And we're going to use a logger. I'm going to use a log4j. Okay. Log this out. New customer. I want to do that for each item in the collections of items. So I'm going to say items for each. Okay, how about that? And all right, so there's that. And the real magic here, the thing I want to show on this side is, of course, the reader, and that's the Kafka reader. So we say reader. Okay, and did we provide the bean already? Nope. Okay, let's do that here. So at bean, Kafka item reader. Simple, right? Right. Okay, so first things first, we need a new Kafka item reader builder. And it'll be, did I say string? It's a long, isn't it? So it's a long and a customer. So what partitions? Well, I'm just going to use one. I've only got the one at this point. We need some consumer properties, and this is where, you know, we get some help with the auto configuration here. Var props equals new properties. Okay, and what I need is the consumer properties from the property file, the application.properties. So I'll inject the Kafka properties object, which is behind the scenes here. It's kind of a thing that gets leaked from the auto configuration, but I do need it, so I'll use that. So properties, props.putAll. This dot properties dot what do I want? Build consumer properties, I guess. Yes, looks right. Okay. And give it a name. It's going to be called customers reader, sure. And build. And do I want to save state? You betcha I do. Okay. Oh, and we need a topic, don't we? We need to tell it. We need to tell it where to read from, right? So topic will be customers. That's what we said, right, in the property file. So I could probably have injected that too. I should probably not duplicate that, but the default topic is here for the reader. Sorry, for the writer, and on the consumer side, it's customers here. So they're sharing the same address in the broker. Okay, I think that's it. We need to plug that in. Kafka item reader. Got the writer. So we know we've already got data in the database. We already saw that, right? I wrote a bunch of data to Kafka. It's here. We needed to pull that data out now. Okay. So there's all that. Let's now read it using this consumer. And there we go. Doesn't host this topic partition. Well, that doesn't seem fair. Is it 0? I should have done 0. What kind of nerd am I that I didn't use 0? Visual Basic nerd, that's what kind. Alright, what have I done now? Oh. It says that I can't cast a string to a so why would it do that? Did I screw up the property configuration here? let's see, for the consumer side, value deserializer is JSON deserializer. Long seems legit. Trusted packages are correct. And I somehow where does it Write items, do the write. Well, did I have sort of incorrect data? I've got a writer. What's the writer's issue? Item reader. What's the item writer made of? Long customer, long and customer. Unmodifiable collection. So it's saying that it's got the value that it has is a value deserializer on the I had a properties element in there, so it was trying to use the default. Oh, that's so bad. Okay, so that should work. If you can't command click on it inside of the IDE, I'm using the properties element, which is just a map of arbitrary keys and values. It doesn't mean anything. So it was trying to use the default. No wonder it was so upset. Okay, so there we go. Look at that. When I fix that, it now knows about the right deserializer, and there's all my data. And that, my friends, has been a very quick look at using Kafka and Spring Batch. And again, the real opportunity here is it's in the integration. It's in the possible integrations, the streaming to batch and batch to streaming use cases. Imagine taking data off of a message queue and then writing it to some sort of persistent store or archiving it or whatever, putting it in a warehouse for analytics. This is exactly the kind of glue code that you need to write to get that kind of work done. And it could be also the place where you do the processing in of itself, right? So Spring Batch is great for this kind of stuff. All in all, I'm super excited to see this land in Spring Batch. I hope you'll give it a shot and feedback. Obviously, we're not yet G8, so the sooner the better. All right, thanks so much for watching, and again, we'll see you next time.